Action. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see so many on the call and especially some familiar faces. I'm delighted to be with you today. I need to start out by saying that when Marie invited me to talk to the Rotary E-Club of Social Justice, my immediate reaction was, I really don't know a lot about social justice. I'm a proud naturalized US citizen, but I did not grow up in America. So I don't have the sort of intuitive background that each of you probably have about social justice issues in the United States. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm halfway through reading Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Caste, which is a powerful, hard to read book, which I think all high school students should be required to read. But in a weak moment, talking to Marie, and we had a great call, I said, possibly I could say something about social justice issues in New Zealand. And much to my dismay, Marie grabbed onto that and said, what a good idea. Let's provide a contrast between the American approach and the New Zealand approach to social justice issues. And it sounded good at the time, but then I realized I knew about as much about social justice issues in New Zealand as I do about social justice issues in the United States. So I've had to do some quick reading to get up to speed. So what I'd like to do is sort of perhaps talk for 10 or 15 minutes on social justice issues as I understand them in New Zealand. And then I'd really like to open up and have a discussion. I suspect that those on this call have forgotten more about social justice issues than I have learned. And I'd really like to learn from you. The board of Rotary International is concerned about these macro issues: diversity, equity, and inclusion. How does Rotary grapple with some of the more difficult strategic issues? And social justice is one of them. We had an example of this just 2 days ago. A very senior past RI director made some very, very unfortunate comments in an audience, homophobic comments, and they have gone viral around the Rotary world, particularly to Rotaract clubs. And so I've just finished a 1-hour meeting with Holger Knaak and the Vice President of Rotary International, preparing a statement to address this issue. We're meeting again immediately after this call. So Rotary increasingly is being drawn into social justice issues. And that's why I would like to benefit from your guidance and your wisdom. So with that introduction, let me say a bit about New Zealand, and we can see where this takes us. So as Marie mentioned, I was brought up in New Zealand. And when I was at school in the 50s and 60s, we were taught that New Zealand had 3 million people, 9 million cows, and 60 million sheep. That was the sort of the perceived wisdom. And I don't quite know when, but at some point, I became aware of the fact that we have a significant indigenous population in New Zealand known as the Maoris. I think it was when I was at high school that I first met a Maori. Just another kid, a little darker than me. You may find this hard to believe, but when I was young, my hair was jet black. Now it's jet white. But in those days, I was very black and I was quite tanned. And from time to time, I was taken for being of Maori descent. So we became aware of Maoris, but only as in a very general sense. When I went to university, I became a little more aware of the fact that Maoris were represented in Parliament. There were 4 seats reserved for the Maori population, and I began to become more aware of New Zealand's indigenous population and how we've dealt with the relationship between the Maori and the white community. The Maori word for the white community is Pakeha. So we talk about Maoris and Pakehas. So a little bit of history. Our equivalent of the US Declaration of Independence is called the Treaty of Waitangi. And it was signed on the 6th of February in 1840. The white colonists came from England in the late 18th century, 1780s, 1790s, and they discovered that there was an indigenous population in New Zealand. Initially, things were fairly peaceful, but then, as you would expect, fighting broke out. The Maoris resisted the white person's attempt to take their lands and to exercise governance over the Maori population, and things became fairly tense. But in 1840, the white population, which at that time was basically ruled from London. New Zealand was colonized from England. Unlike Australia, I hope there are no Australians on the call, but Australia basically was a penal colony. And it was colonized by convicts. New Zealand never had any convicts. It was a planned community. You had to be between the age of 18 and 25. If you were married, you could have no more than 2 children. And you were essentially assigned a block of land in Wellington or Auckland or one of the cities in New Zealand, so that when you arrived in the early part of the 1800s, you had the basis for making a home and a life for yourself. But hostilities broke out in 1830, 1835, 1839, and eventually the British decided that it was time to establish a treaty which would determine the rights of the Maoris versus the rights of the white population. The treaty was drawn up in the space of 2 or 3 days. It's a very short document. It has 3 provisions. First, the Maoris cede the sovereignty of New Zealand to Britain. Secondly, the Maoris give the Crown, the British Crown, an exclusive right to buy lands they wish to sell, and in return, a guaranteed full rights of ownership of their lands, forests, fisheries, and other possessions. And thirdly, the Maoris are given the rights and privileges of British subjects. Very simple, but the treaty was signed in both English and in Maori. And at that time, Maori was very much a spoken language. There were no Maori texts. As a result, there are differing interpretations of the Maori version and the British version. The British version was signed on February the 6th. The Maori version was signed by some 500 Maori chiefs over the space of the next 9 months. It took a long time before the Maori tribes, and not all of them signed, eventually signed on. So a very brief document, didn't get all the legal drafting that the Declaration of Independence got over here, but it became the basis for regulating the respective rights between the Maoris and the white community. So there were skirmishes throughout the 1860s, 1870s, But the Maoris, the New Zealand population at that time was very small, and the Maori population was very small. So there were no sort of significant issues. New Zealand eventually became an independent country from England in 1947. The 1950s were taken up with overcoming the Second World War. New Zealanders lost more men per capita in that war than any other country except for Russia. And a large number of young people, young men, including my father, went overseas to fight in World War II. So in the 1950s, it was a time of getting back together, recovering from the impact of the war. In the 1960s and 70s, the Maoris started to voice their concerns in an increasingly strident way. And New Zealand also opened up. We privatized. We became, instead of an agricultural backwater at the other end of the world, the last stop before the Antarctic, we became much more engaged in international affairs and carved out a niche for ourselves as an independent sovereign nation, independent from England and Great Britain. 90% of the white population in New Zealand would claim that they are from Britain, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland. Currently, the Maori population amounts to about 16% of the country. It's our largest ethnic group after the white population. And as I said, in the 60s and 70s, Maoris became more anxious to claim their rights. In 1975, the government established what we call the Waitangi Tribunal, somewhat similar to the Truth and Reconciliation commissions that have been established in Canada and South Africa and other parts of the world. The function of the tribunal was mainly to determine the rights of Maoris to land. The tribunal had the authority to go right back to 1840 and to do a lot of research on ownership of land, forests and fisheries and so on. And since then, they have delivered, I think, something like 2,000 reports dealing with claims to Maori land. A very large part of New Zealand, something like 75% of the entire country, has been claimed at one point or another by the Maoris. And the tribunal has resolved many of these claims. Once the tribunal makes a finding as to whether or not a claim is acceptable, the government then is required to enter into a settlement process with the relevant Maori tribe or tribes to determine what is a fair award for the injustice that was claimed. So many of these claims have now been resolved. Maoris have got the right over land. It's and many contracts are concluded subject to the rights of Maoris. So increasingly, the influence of the Maoris has become quite pervasive in New Zealand. Maori language is taught in many schools. There are courses in Maori. There's a Maori land court. There's a Maori broadcasting authority. Many place names have been translated into Maoris. I think New Zealanders, by and large, are very proud of their Maori heritage. I certainly am. I never really grew up with much Maori contact, but now when I go down to New Zealand and I see the pervasive influence of Maoris, it's a source of pride in New Zealand. Every high school would have what we call a Maori haka. Haka is a Maori war dance. And any time New Zealand plays rugby against Australia or England or America, traditionally the New Zealand team will do a Maori war dance to psych out the opposition. And every high school would have its own haka. So as a child, I learnt Pake awatea, rai wai chakia, ti kongama, ti ma. I need a glass of wine to get that out. So that wasn't a very good rendition. Maybe I'll come back some other time. So I won't say there's not some tension between the Maoris and the white person, but we had none of the history that I think America's had. We've never had laws preventing a Maori from marrying a white person. In fact, there are statistics to indicate that by 2050, virtually everybody in New Zealand will have some Maori influence in their blood. There are parts of the country where Maori is very prominent. For those of you who've been to New Zealand, Rotorua is probably the center of the Maori community. Maoris have their own traditions, their own meeting houses, their own customs. But people live in peace. I mean, Maoris, it's not an issue. We don't sort of feel that Maoris are inferior. They're not discriminated against. There's no suggestion that Maoris are not treated as well. I think Maoris, as is the case with African Americans in America, Maoris are disproportionately represented in our prisons. There's greater poverty issues with the Maori population. There's no discrimination in employment or education, no overt discrimination. The Maoris have equal rights. It's not something that we dwell over. But the reality is that the Maori community hasn't done as well economically, and so there are poverty issues. We also have quite a large island population. Islanders from Fiji, from Tonga, from the Tokelau, from many of the South Pacific Islands, particularly in Auckland, which is a city of 1.5 million people. There's a very big island population, and many of them have the free right to come into New Zealand without a visa. So there have been some racial issues between the Maoris and the Polynesian community. There are occasionally flare-ups between the Maoris and the white community as well. But by and large, I think it's fair to say that the Maoris and the white community live in relative peace. As I said, by law, there were 4 seats in the parliament reserved to Maoris. We only have one house. We did away with the upper house way back in the 1950s. We've gone from 3 million when I was a child. We're now at around 5 million apparently, but we only have one house of parliament, and we've done away with the Maori, the compulsory Maori seats, and Maoris now have their own parties. I think there are 2 parties represented in Maori. The Deputy Prime Minister is a Maori. The Governor General, the head of state in New Zealand, has been a Maori. We have Maoris everywhere. The head of the armed forces, bishops. It's not a big issue. We don't. I've been out of New Zealand for almost 30 years, so I may be a little bit out of touch with the day-to-day realities, but my sense is that we don't have the same structural disparities with the Maori population as we see is here. Someone asked slavery, we've never had slavery, never. So the question about reparations, that's the function of the Waitangi Tribunal, to resolve land disputes. They claim that land was taken wrongfully as a result of Maori wars. And many of those claims have been upheld, and the Maoris have been given back their rights to land. And there are quite large chunks of New Zealand, mainly in rural areas, which are Maori owned, and just like any other ownership. They're private. The Maoris tend to own property collectively. I mean, Maoris can buy a house and own a house in just the same way as anybody else, but traditionally Maori land is owned by the tribe and dealt with by the tribe on behalf of all the members of the tribe. So I've talked for quite a few minutes. Marie, if you think this would be a good time to pause and open up the discussion. I've seen the